everyone, my name is Prachi and I love making mobile apps. Today, join Himanshu and me to make the app more maintainable and offline first on the DevFest Day 3 mobile track. Guys, in the previous sessions, we have successfully built the Book My Show clone app in which we have designed the UI, made API call, and worked on displaying the data in dynamic UI. In today's session, we are going to make our app more maintainable and offline first. When I say that we want to make an app more maintainable, it means like if we are working on a bigger project, something like Book My Show, then there would be more than one developers working on the same screen and same classes, and we do not want them to have conflicts and mergers in the code. So, a maintainable app enables us and the developers to avoid conflicts. Also, if there is some other class or activity using the same functions and calling the same APIs, then the code can be reused and there is no duplication of code. And Google has introduced Mvvm architecture, which stands for Model View, View Model. What Mvvm architecture suggests is that view, that means in our case, activity or fragment, the sole task of activity and fragment is to uh, hold the UI components like buttons and edit text box and text boxes and stuff like that. The task of displaying data is delegated to view model. View model, on the other hand, is responsible for bringing data and understand the UI events that has been triggered by the user, such as on tap, button click, double tap, or drag and drop. So, the responsibility of bringing and making data operations goes to repository. Repository, on the other hand, has two data sources in MVVM. One is local data source and the other is remote data source. Local data source is somewhat similar to the database, and remote data source is something where data is called from the API. Now, let's get started to the coding. Since we are going to take care of data, so I'm going to make the package data and I'm going to make remote calls. Now, motto here is that if you can see main activity, right now main activity is doing the task of fetching data, which is no longer going to be its work. It is to be delegated to view model. However, view model is going to delegate the data task to repository. And since main activity was doing the task of fetching movies, I'm going to keep this method here for reference. I'm going to just copy paste and make the function and just document the function here because interface does not allow the body of the function. So as you can see, I will need an API. So I'm going to send the API string new Kotlin class is IMPL. So this is my implementation class. But in order to have this fetch movies function here, I will need to implement my repository and then I can take the function. Now I can easily take all the code this fetch movies method and put it in the repository so that repository can make the API calls. just going to paste it here. But however, retrofit builder is something that I do not want to create the instance in the implementation. This is because I do not want this to be a new variable to be created every time I'm fetching the movies. So what will I do? I will just take the movie service in constructor of my implementation. The API key is no longer going to be fetched from main activity. I'm already taking it in the fetch movies parameter. So I'm just going to remove and put it here. So as you can see in the previous, when I copy pasted the code from main activity here, what happened is you can already see that there are so many functions which are taking which are handling the UI from this class, which is not good, which is not the responsibility of the repository implementation class. So this is the success, this is the error. Two methods which are ready to use for the view model, and for that, like few languages like Java, Scala, and such and other languages, Kotlin also introduces the Lambda functions. Our fetch movies function gives two types of responses, which is on success. It gives me a movie response, and on error, it gives me a string. Since these on success and on error functions are going to return nothing, I'm just going to put that it returns unit. Unit is the return value. Since I have changed the signature of the interface, the signature of the fetch movies in the implementation class also needs to be changed. Now, this is one thing. Finally, I need movie response to be sent on this on success method. And from where will I get that response? It's all here. So I'm just going to call the on success method, and it is going to take the response dot body, and my on error method is going to take response dot message, which is a string, and on failure it is going to give me on error. It's still not over. Okay, so here we get a smart cast option which says that movie response is impossible because response.body is a complex expression. Now, even though I have manually checked that the response.body should not be null, my compiler is not satisfied and he wants me to throw a null pointer exception in case this happens. So I'm just going to put the the null assertions. So see, it gives me a suggestion. If I do this, it's done. In the next phase, we will be taking care and creating the functionality of local database, and we would be creating view model and display the data to the view. For that, we have with us Himanshu. Himanshu, over to you.
Hey guys, how are you all? Thank you so much, Prachi, for handing over to me. And now what I'm going to do is I'll actually define a lot of different things where we are going to first make our app, which the data is coming from the repository to the activity class. Then we are going to use our local storage. So what I'm going to do is I'll quickly move to my Android Studio. And here, if you remember, right, that Prachi has done till this point. Now, as a next step, what I need to do is I need to pass this data, which is coming from the fetch movies function, to this via a view model to this activity. So for now, I'll create a new file. I'll name it as main view model. Inside this, we are going to create a class. I'll name it as class main view model, and I'll extend it with view model. So basically, view model is the layer between the data layer and your UI presentation. It's basically the way how you extract the data and give it to the UI. So now here what we are going to do is we are going to take the data from this main repository implementation class, and via this channel, the main view model, we are going to throw it to the main activity. That's what we are going to do. So now, as a next step, what I want is I want to have a condition check. You remember, if from the main activity they created a network helper here and they checked if the network is connected, right? So that is what I'm going to do here as well. I need to check that if internet is present or not. So for that aspect, I'm going to pass some data in this constructor, because a very basic rule of programming says that we don't have to create an object inside a class. It's always better to pass it from outside. So that is the reason we are going to use it in the constructor, and we are going to pass it via the activity file which we have. So for that, I'll create a private variable. I'll name it as network helper. Similarly, for this to get data from this main repository, I'm also going to create another variable in the constructor, which would be of type main repository. So I'll create another private variable. I'll name it as movie repository, and that's it. So we have passed two different variables inside the constructor, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'll create a function. I'll name it as, let's say, on create. And inside this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if the internet connection is present or not. So I'll put that condition check inside the if condition, that if network helper is network connected. That actually means that the network is connected. Then what we are going to do is we are going to do the fetch movies API call. Now, you might be wondering that we did our all API calls inside a movie repository implementation class. But here what we are doing is, in the view model, we are passing the repository. Just bear with me for a second. I'll be explaining that when I pass the data from the activity to the view model. So inside that, what I'm going to do is I'll do movie repository.fetch movies. Now we need an API key, and that API key, if you remember, is present here. So I'll just cut this and I'll paste it here. Now here I'll pass the API key which we have created. Now, as a thumb of rule, right, just make sure whenever we create a constant variables, just make it private const inside the companion object. So that's pretty much it, how you have to do it. Now, if you remember again, the main repository has two Lambda functions. So a Lambda function is basically a normal function which takes a parameter in the constructor, how we have done in the view model here. Similarly, we also have a return value of unit. That basically means it doesn't return anything, right? Now in Kotlin, if you have to use it, you just use the curly braces here, and I'll add another one for the on error. So that's it. So we have added two Lambda functions callback. So here you can see it returns a movie response, which is basically the on success, and it also returns the error here. So now, as a next step, what we need to do, we need to pass the data movie response from this view model to this main activity, correct? So for passing that data, we are going to create variables. Now, these variables are not going to be of type movie response. Rather, it is actually going to be a mutable live data. So first, let me add it. Then I'll explain what is a live data. So when we are doing this, right? So you remember in Kotlin, we have two different things: a mutable live data and a live data. So a difference between mutable and immutable, or basically a live data, it actually means that mutable data sets can be actually changed and manipulated. So since we need to add a movie response here, I'll create a mutable live data here. And now the ones which I want to observe, right, in the activity has to be non-mutable. So that is the reason I'll create another variable. I'll name it as val movie response, and this would be of type live data, which has a parameter of movie response. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this as a value. So I'll pass the Kotlin function of get, and here I'll pass movie response. So what it actually did was, we are going to set the data here in this movie response variable, the underscore one. And the reason I'm passing underscore is just to give you a context that this is a private variable which would not be exposed to main activity. Post value. Now I'm going to post the movie response here. So I'll just call the it. That's how you can do it. Or even a better practice I recommend is, you can use movie response here as the variable name, and you can directly pass this here in the post value. So it gives you a more clarity that what kind of data you're passing to this movie response. Now, what we did here actually is, we did the API call, and when we did the API call on the on success response, we are passing that to the mutable live data. Now, similarly, like this, I'm going to create another live data, and that would be for handling errors. So I'll pass here error response, and now you can see I'll be using underscore to make it private. And just to make you sure, I'll explain again what kind of naming conventions I'm using. So here you can see on the private variables, I'm using an underscore, and the ones which are not private, which is going to get exposed to the UI, would not have an underscore here. So here I'll pass the type string, and I'll just create its object. Now to expose it, I'll create another variable. I'll name it as error response. I'll pass the type here first, live data. This would be of type string. And similarly, how we did above, we'll pass the underscore error response as its value. Now, what we did here, we created two different variables of live data. One was mutable, another was immutable. Now, the mutable data can be changed. How we are changing the data? Now, I'll use this error response variable here, and I'll pass the error here. So I'll use error response dot post value, and this it is actually returning me the values. So the error values. So I'll pass it here, and to just make you understand, we are actually done with it. So we didn't have to spend a lot of time in Viewmodel, because the lot of tasks which we had to perform was already performed in this implementation class. It did the API call for us. It had the on success and on error callbacks. And now I just created a view model here, and inside that I put a condition check that if network is connected, just call the fetch movies function, and inside that just pass the API key. The movie response gets returned on the on success callback, which you pass to the live data. And similarly for the errors, right? That is pretty much done. Now what we are going to do is, we are going to observe these two live data. It has to be observed in this main activity, correct? So one thing which you have to actually remember when you are working with the Jetpack components is that when you create a view model here like this, right? So you don't get to pass anything inside it. So basically the easy way to do is like this. But since we are passing something from outside, you can't directly call an object for it. So to pass something here, you actually need to pass the network helper and the movie repository via a factory. So when I say factory, it doesn't mean that it will create something, but what it will do is it will just help us to pass some data from this activity to the view model. So now inside the UI, I'll create another package. I'll name it as util, and inside this as well, I'll create another file. I'll name it as main view model factory. So to give you a very basic context, what main view model factory does, it takes the parameters which we need to pass to the view model from the view and passes it to the view model while creating it. So that's the only work a factory does. So now first let me go to this main activity, I'm going to here define our view model first. I'm going to create a private variable again. It would be of view model, and it would be of type main view model. Now inside this, I'm going to first create another function. I'll name it as setup view model. Now inside this function, we are going to assign our view model, the one which we created inside this, right? So I'll do view model is equals. Now to create an object, you can't do it like this, main view model and something like this, because it is actually extending the Jetpack view model, right? If you remember it. I hope you do. This one. So for that, to assign an object here, we need to use view model provider. So view model provider helps us to invoke an object for that main view model which we created. Now, this takes two things. First, it will take an owner, view model store owner, if you remember this. So the owner is basically the UI which owns the whole view model. So the UI component here is the activity. So I'll just pass this. Now it takes a factory. Now we need to pass the factory here, but we just created the class. We didn't do anything here in the factory. So now let's also create the class factory here. Now we need to pass two different things, right? Network helper and a movie repository. So what I'll do is I'll just copy it and I'll pass it in its constructor like this, because I don't want to take some time just to explain why I'm doing this. Just to a context, if you remember that we need to pass network helper and a movie repository. So I just copy pasted it, and now this part actually extends view model provider dot new instance factory. Now I'll create this object, and that's it. So now what we did here was we created our factory to pass network helper and the movie repository to this factory. Now, the next step on this part is we need to pass these two dependencies to this view model, correct? So this view model new instance factory actually has a function which we call create. Now, this is actually a create function which will help us create the view model instance. So we only have a view singular one, right? The main view model. So for that, I'll use return. I'll pass main view model and I'll create its object. So now you would see it requires two things, which we already have in our constructor. So I'll pass network helper, comma, I'll pass movie repository. But it still throws an error. The reason is we need to cast it to this T, because T is the return type here. So I'll pass as T. Now since we have casted it, the error is gone, but it says unchecked cast. So I'll just put a warning here, and the warning is gone. So now in this part, which we created is a view model factory to pass some required dependencies from the UI, that is our main activity, to our main view model. Now since we are done with that part, what we are going to do, we'll quickly jump to main activity, and now here I'm actually going to pass the view model factory, correct? So our main view model factory is main view model factory. Now this also requires two things, right? So you remember this network helper. I'll just cut this because Niharika and Shriyank has already saved a lot of time for me. So I'm passing the network helper here as it required a network helper. Now we need to pass this movie repository. Now here comes the trick part. I'm not actually going to pass that specific interface, correct? Correctly, this movie service is actually being going to use to create the response from the response or the failures, right? So we need to also pass this main repository implementation class. Now this requires the movie service, and we don't have to look way ahead. This is also done by other speakers here. So I'll just cut this and I'll paste it here. Now you can see the error is gone here because main view model factory required a helper and a movie repository. Now we both have that. Now the reason we are passing movie repository implementation class, and here we are using main repository, and still it doesn't throw an error, right? You can see that this error is something different, but the main view model factory doesn't throw an error. The reason is the repository implementation class is tentatively extending the movie repository itself, correct? So when it's extending a movie repository, it becomes of that same family. No matter if you pass movie implementation or if you pass movie repository, it still works the same because it extends the property of movie repository. Now, since we are done with this part, we need to also initialize the class of main view model. So to pass it, we'll just use main view model, and here to get the class, we'll use double colon class.java. Hold on, just I think I missed a bracket somewhere. Okay, I need to add a bracket here, and that's done. So what we did here was we actually initialized our view model, the late init variable which we have, correct? And we used the main view model factory to pass the network helper and the movie repository to the view model via this factory, right? So we are done initializing the view model. And now, if you remember, we created this on create. So now this on create plays the best part out here. So this on create has to be called like this view model dot on create. So when this invocation of generating an object for view model is done, basically this step, then we just call the onCreate function of view model. And now we are done. So when we call this, right, what would happen is that in this view model, this function gets called, basically the API gets called, and we get our responses. Now we need to remove this part and we need to use this movie response and this error response to observe the data. So that's the best part about live data. So when you have assigned a value to this live data using movie responses post value and error response dot post value, right? Now we can observe directly because it's getting assigned to it. So for that, I'll create an observe view model. So in this function, I'm going to actually observe these two variables which I created, right? So now to observe a view model, there's a very trick part how we do it. So you just call view model dot movie response. Now this doesn't return value. Now we actually need to observe it. So we'll use observe, and here I'll pass the instance of the activity. So for that I'll pass this, and I'll pass observer. Now this would return the movie response. Similarly, I'll do for error response dot observe this observer. Now, since we are done observing this, I'm just going to quickly cut and paste stuff. So this I'll copy, show error message, and in the response of, okay, and so in the observing of error response, I'm going to call this show error message. And rather than passing that get string, I'll pass the it, because we are already getting it from the observer error response, right? Similarly, we are also going to take this show movies and we are going to call it here. Now, this requires it.results, right? So we are done with this part. Now, as the next step, what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and delete this function. I'll delete this function from this part as well. And I'll delete this late init variable. So we did nothing very different in this activity. Rather, what we just did was we observed the view models after creating the instance of it and then just calling the onCreate. Now, we also have to use this hide progress and show progress here. So for that, what I'll do is when we call the setup view model, right, I'll just show the progress bar here. Similarly, when we are done with showing this movie, so I'll hide the progress bars here and here as well. So we are done implementing the view model and fetching the data from this repository which Prachi created and showing it to the UI. So let me run this code first. And when I show you my device, the emulator, you can see this thing actually runs, right? So basically what we did here was we created first a view model. We created a view model because we wanted to extract the data which we have in this movie repository implementation and throw it to the UI, right? So we created that. Now, as a next step, we passed a movie repository as as a constructor parameter and as well as the network helper. So this movie repository was responsible for doing this call of fetch movies, right? So we did that inside our on create, and Now the best part is we just use the Lambda functions and the power of live data with it to just assign a value to this mutable live data. And in the next step in the activity file, we just created two different functions, setup view model and observe view model. Inside the setup view model, we initialized the view model, main view model here, and inside that we passed our factory class. Now again, the factory class, you need network helper and a movie repository. Now, because we need to pass these two dependencies, correct? So we created our factory which extends view model dot new instance factory, and that's pretty much done. Now, when we initialized it, we also called our onCreate function. If you remember it, we created, right? Don't forget this step. This is the most important step. If you don't call it, you would not get your movies. And that's something you need to keep in mind. When you did this, our all implementation of view model was done. So when we called it, the API data were getting set. And now in the observe view model function, we just had to observe movie responses and the error response. Now when it is showing up, we actually see that in our UI. So that's done when we have to do our remote API calls, right? Now let's take a step ahead. And this is a very basic thing which you are done. So if you don't have to do any changes, you are still good. This app is completed. But let's go a step ahead now. Yeah. So what the next step I'm going to do is, I don't want to do a condition check where if the data is not there. So for example, let's explain you a very niche concept, right? When you use an Instagram application, you still can comment when the internet is not there. And when the internet is there, it actually moves ahead, and then at that point it syncs the data from your local storage. So what we are going to do in this application is we are putting a condition check, if you remember, right? I hope you do. That network helper dot is network connected. So when we do that API call, what we do is we check for the connection. What if the connection is not there? We still want to show the user the data, because if we don't show the user the data, the problem comes up is the user might drop off, right? And that's a bad aspect, because if you're building an app, you don't want a user to go. There are repercussions of it, like you would get a 1 star, and I don't like 1 star reviews coming up, right? So what I'm going to teach you here is, when you're getting an API call from, when you're getting the data from the API call, sorry, my bad, then at that point you're going to store that data in our local storage. And let's add certain condition. If internet is not there, then what we are going to do is we are going to show that data from our local repository. So for that, now as a next step here, what we are going to do is we are going to create our database, the room database which we have, and we are going to store that values, the response basically which we get from this API call here inside that. But here comes the best part. We don't have to change this movie response or the error response. It still remains the same how main activity we have implemented, and we don't have to change anything. The whole change which we have to do goes inside this. So inside this we have to do all the changes. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see what we have to do now. So I have already created three different packages: DAO, entity, and type converter, right? And we have a data package which we have local and remote. So inside this remote, we already have this stuff which I'm not going to talk about. I'm just going to use movie service and repository builder, as I'll minimize it. The only thing where I'm going to work is this implementation class and this repository. So now I explained you why we need it, right? Now let me just show you few couple of things we need actually to design our database. So the one thing which we are going to use is room data. The room database is responsible for storing the data in our local storage. Now, room database can be divided into three different aspects. One is an entity, one is a DAO or a data access object. From now onwards, I'm going to call it DAO, and the database instance itself. So let me break this entity first for you. So if we're in a database table, right, a database has n number of tables, and each table has its own structure. So in Kotlin or in room database for per se, entity is that specific structure of the table, right? So that's what entities are. DAOs or database access object is like a mediator between a view and so this is going to be used as a whole source of connection between the database to pass on the data. And at last, we have our database instance. So this is the place where we store our initialization of our database, where we pass our entities and DAO. Now, this is done for the theory part. Now let me move to the Android Studio, and we are going to implement our room database here. So I'll just show you the file quickly. We have our room dependency added here, the runtime, right? Now, in this, we are going to first move this movie response and movie to entity like this, because I'm not going to create another classes here. I'm just going to move it here. And now I'll go to movie response. So to make any data class as an entity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to annotate it with entity like this. And I have to also pass the table name. So my table name here would be TBL. So I'm just giving TBL because I want to initialize and I want you to understand it's a table name, movie data. So that's my table name. And now this would act as a structure of my database. So that's the data class which we have. Now each database, right, table actually has columns, and each columns has specific values, right? So I'm going to assign this list of movies as one of the columns. So I'll use column info, and here I'll pass the name. So it would be movie response as the name. Now we also have a primary key which we need to create to make it sure that the response is not duplicated. So I'll add a primary key, val page int is equals 1, right? So I'm adding this for the reason because of the response, if you remember, had this page. So we created our entity here. Basically, our entity would be table structure with the column info name. Now we are going to create a DAO here. So DAO is basically nothing but an interface. So I'll add it as movie DAO. It would be an interface movie DAO like this. And this also goes with the annotation like this. Now this would have two different functions. One would be insert movies, which would take movie response as a parameter. Another function would be get movies. Now this would return the movie response. Now we are going to do two different functions here, right? We want to get some data using get movies, and we are going to use insert movies as a function, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to mark it as insert because we are going to insert something here. And here we want to get something. So I'll use query, and this query would be the SQL statement. So this SQL statement would be select, basically select, then I'll pass star, basically means again select all the data from the table which we created. So this actually means select all the data from the table. Now here in this insert, what we are going to do is we want to check what if the movie response comes same again. Basically there's a conflict. The previous stored data and the new data coming up is actually same or not. So if it comes same, we'll add on conflict strategy which says on conflict strategy dot replace. So what this would do is this would replace the data if both are same. So we are done with creating the DAO. Now we also have a type converter. So the reason I created a type converter already, I'll explain you first, but let me quickly go to movie response. So when we use to store data in our room database, right, we can't actually store a list there. We are actually have to use only the basic components like the primary ones, integer, string, and something which is very primary. List doesn't come into the primary variables. So we need to convert this as a string. So for that reason, we used this movie type converter, and I'll use type converter here like this, and I'll pass the movie type converter. I'll pass the class instance of it, and that's it. So basically what this converter does is it converts the list to a string, and then it converts that string to the list. So we are done with this. Now the last step for this database is you need to actually create the database instance. I'll name it as movie database. Now this would be an abstract class, and at last it would extend the room database, and I'll open the objects for it. Now to mark it as a database, I'll use database and notation, and now this takes entity, the array of entities. So we have only one entity like this. So for that, I'll pass movie response, the entity which we created, and the class of it. Similarly, we'll also pass the version. I'll pass it one, the initial version. So what version does is, if let's say we change the entity structure, we need to upgrade the version and then ship the app. Now, since we use a type converter here, right, we'll use an annotation called type converter like this, and I'll pass the movie converter as well, the class instance. So now we have our database instance ready. I'll create another abstract function. I'll name it as movie DAO, and this would extend the movie DAO we created. So to access this movie DAO, what we are going to do is we are going to pull it off from the view file, and first we have to initialize this movie database. Now, to create an instance of this movie database, we have to create the companion like this, and inside that, first I'm going to create a constant variable. This would be the name of database name, and I'll name it as movie app. Now I'll create another variable. I'll name it as instance. So this would be basically the instance of movie database, but the initial value would be null. I'll explain why I kept it null. I'll also keep it volatile. The reason I'm keeping it volatile because I want it to be constructive. It can be a heavy operation, and that is the reason I'm keeping it as a volatile. Now, the last step on this is I'll just create another function. I'll name it as getInstance, which takes a context for us, and last it extends the movie database. So inside this, we are going to return the movie days instance, which is basically this. But before returning, we need to assign something to it, right? We can't return a null value. So for that, first I'll use the synchronized keyword. It actually does the lock. So when I call this synchronize, it actually means then when a thread is actually accessing this function, no other thread can access this function again. So basically, you can't create two different instances of this function. So here I'll create a function. I'll name it as instance, and I'll pass the value as instance, the one which you created. Then I'll put a condition check if instance is equals to null, which initially it would be, right? Because do I need to explain this one? Because we initially had it null. Now inside this, I'm going to do instance is equals room database. Now I have to build it. So I'll use the builder. Sorry, I have to use room dot database builder. Now this takes a context. So the first context I have to pass is of the application context because I want my database to have an instance, the same instance throughout the application. Then I need to pass the database class, movie database, class instance of it. And at last I need to pass the name like this. So when we are done with this, we just need to build it and we are done. So we have initialized instance like this. And as the last step, I'll assign the instance variable like this again back to instance. Now instance has this value, right? Now, as the last step, we'll just return the instance which we created. Now you can see the instance is done and we are done with creating our database instance. So basically what we did here was we created an abstract class which has to be extended via different functions, right? So we created a companion object instance, get instance function, and inside this we initialized our room database. So we did that part, right? We are done with that part. Now as the next step, what we are going to do, we are going to pass this movie DAO here in this. Just let me go to the implementation class here. So we need just to get the data, right? So first instance is to insert the movies, and the second step is to get the movies. So for that we need this DAO instance. So I'll go quickly to main repository function. or maybe I'll go to the main repository interface first, and here I'll create another function. I'll name it as func get movies local. It would have only one function, and that is the lambda of movie response, similar to what we have. And here I'll implement that function quickly. Now we are done implementing it. Now we need the instance of movie DAO here. So for that specific thing, what we are going to do is I'll create another variable of movie DAO. That's the one which we wanted to create. And now I'll just keep on updating file by file. So here, as a next step, what we need to do, we need to first insert the values, right? So to insert it, we need to do it in this call, because if the response is successful, that basically means we are getting our data. So to do any operations on room database, you can't do it on the main thread. You need to actually do it in your background or the worker thread. To do that, we have a lot of different options if you're using coroutines RX Java. But here for you guys, we are going to do the basic core project. So here I'll create a thread instance and I'll start it. So this, what we do is, it would not do on the main UI thread, rather it would just do an implementation call on the separate thread. So now to store some sort of data, what I'll do, I'll just call movies dot insert movies. And now I'll just pass response dot body. How we had it before, nothing else. I'll also move this here. So what this would do is, when the insert movie is successful, it will return the success, right? And as a last step, we want to return the values, right, from the get movies local. So same thing, what I'll do is here thread. I'll start the instance of thread, and here I'll pass on success. Inside this, I'll use movie dot get movies. So we are done executing this part where we need to actually get the data from the movies DAO, which would help eventually to get the data from the database table and the tables which we created in the entity, right? Now, first let me jump to the main activity. You would see an error coming up. The error, I'll explain it to you, because it requires a movie DAO, but it has movie services. Because first initially we just had movie service. Now I'll add a dependency for movies DAO. So for that, what I'll do is I'll call movie database dot get instance. And now I'll pass the instance of like this, and I'll just add the parameters. Now I have created the instance of our database like this, right? Now it requires the DAO. So if you remember, we had a function called movies DAO there, the one which we created here, abstract function. So we are using that abstract function to get the access of movies DAO. And since we are passing this, basically the context of the activity, and when we go here, we can see we are using the application context. So no matter what context you pass here, it will still be created one instance throughout the application. Now we are done editing the main activity class, and we don't have to do any stuff here, no changes. The last part of the code is here, what we are going to do in the main view model. Now in the main view model, what I'm going to do is, I want to show the data when we don't have an internet connection, right? So inside that, I'll put a condition check here. Any guesses, guys, why I'm putting it here? The guess has to be because we are checking if the network connection is active or is present, then only do this call. If it's not present, what you can do? So for that reason, what I'll do is I'll call movie repository dot get movies local. That actually makes sense, right? Because if the network is not there, just get the local value here. If the network is there, take the values from the internet connection, the updated set, right? So I'll also add the movie response here, like this, how I added for the fetch movies. And now I'll put the mandatory condition checks. If movie response is not is equals to null, so sorry for my typos, and I'll put a condition check as well, and movie response dot results is not empty. Why I'm using is not empty, because there might be a condition check that if the result, the list of movies is empty, right? So for that, I'll just copy paste this part and I'll paste it here. Now, what this does is, if this condition check satisfies, then will actually have this post values, right? Okay, you could see a warning coming up. It says condition is always true. The reason is here we are passing a movie response. So let me make it a nullable type like this. And I have to also implement it here. So why I'm keeping it as a nullable type, because there might be a chance, a very rare use case, that movie response comes null. Now you can see the warning is done, it's not there. So basically we put a condition check that the movie response might be null. And if it's not null, then only assign the movie response to this live data. And at last, the last step of this code is else. Basically, if it's null, what to do? I'll throw an error response. I'll say something went wrong. Now that's pretty much it. So, okay, as a next step, what I'll do is I'll just put this as here as a constant value. I'm just keeping it as modular as you can, because you can understand it later when you see this code. So I'll keep it as something went wrong. And now I'll pass this variable here, because if you remember on the initial when I started, I said anything which has to be constant has to go as a private constant variable in the companion object, right? Now I'm done with this code. What I actually did was I put a condition check that if the network is not there, basically this else block, then get the data from the local. And how it would get a data from the local, because in the movie implementation, what we did, we first inserted the movies using the movie insert movies function, and in the get movies local function which we have, we pass the response using the get movies function of the DAO. Now let me run this quick and see what happens. Let's see what happens. We get our API call, right? So basically we didn't have to change it from the activity file. Now let me quickly delete this. So basically I've closed my internet and I have no internet connectivity, right? So I'll just call this, I'll open it, let's see what happens. So you can see this, right? When I don't have an internet connection, it still runs my application. That is what we wanted to achieve. Okay, so I am done with my code section. Let me give you just an overview. Run did. So when Prachi actually inverted the whole code and implemented the repository in the repository implementation class, she returned that API response from this, right? And it was up to me to how I would use this specific set of data using the main view model and display it in the main activity. So what we did was we first created a main view model. We passed network helper and repository in their constructor, and we used something called live data, right? So by now, I think you have a context and a gist what live data is. Inside that, we created an onCreate function. When we created an onCreate function, we put a condition check. Okay, cool. If you have an internet connection, then do this section code. If we don't have an internet connection, get it from our database. But when you create a view model, right, you can't actually have something inside the constructor, because that's not the pretty good way to do it. But if you have to pass it, you need something called view model factory. So then we went a step ahead. We created a view model factory, and inside it's the create function. We returned the main view model function, main view model, by passing the constructor here. Now, since we were done with this part, the only step I think was remaining was just to display the UI and remove the fetch movies function, because we don't want to do the old stuff, right? We are doing some amazing things right now. So what I did was I deleted all the stuff. I just had two different functions, the newer ones which I created. And here we had the setup view model, and I had an observe view model. So inside the setup view model, I used the main view model factory which I created to pass it in the constructor, right? Just by this point, you should have been remembering this, that we pass it. We passed it. We have this view model provider to invoke the main view model provider. And when we invoked this, we just called the on create. That's it. Now we just observed the view models and displayed the movie and showed the error message if any error pops up. So basically that was it, how we can actually convert an API call to a local storage section and get the responses if we don't have anything. Like let's say if we don't have an internet connection, we still get the data. So this was pretty good session. I hope you guys actually liked it, and I have explained you all the gist of it. Just remember the parts. When you have to create a database, you need three different aspects: the database instance, the DAO, and entity. And if you don't have any primary values which you can store, something like a list which we had, you actually need to create a type converter. And that's the whole architecture setup we had for this DevFest.